Please identify if you hear me, if you see the presentation before you. You can do it by voice if you want, because right now I don't see your messages. Okay, so right now we have a few minutes while we wait for our other colleagues to join us. So I will briefly mention how the things are going to be from now on. Please, if you have any questions, you are free to raise your hand using the raise your hand option in Zoom. I'm pretty sure after a few years of these types of meetings, everyone is familiar with how Zoom functions. And also after every single presentation, we will have a dedicated Q&A time. So you could ask your questions then. And also, obviously, at the end of the entire seminar, we will gladly answer all your questions in regards to our group, our future plans, and maybe, I don't know, something, some other topics that are of interest to you. So while we wait, let's talk about our research group. You already know, and you can see, that we are called the Soviet Theory of War Research Group. What does that mean? Our task within the group is to identify, formulate, systematize the content of moral foundations and moral limitations of war, which manifested themselves in the theoretical level during the Soviet era, which I'm pretty sure everyone knows lasted for many years from 1917 to 1991. At the same time, we intend to give a diverse presentation of the Soviet theory of war. The acuteness and polarity of various discussions about war will not allow us to confine ourselves to highlighting a single position common to all Soviet theorists. To illustrate my point, we could recall a 1947 polemic between Soviet scientists around the significance of teachings of Clausewitz and the reception by Joseph Stalin. As a result of the research, we plan, well, we had a plan, and we intend to continue reaching for it. We want to present a bigger picture, perspective of the concepts of and views of Soviet theorists, politicians, and the military to the ethical dimensions of war. At the same time, we hope that the research material will be of value not only to the post-Soviet space, but can also be considered a significant framework for global discussion. So, of course, today, as you already know, because you signed up for the seminar, we are going to present the 4 directions in which we've been working for the past 4 years. Here with us today are the senior members of our group that will all give their input and insight to how our group functions. If you want, you now have time to yet again familiarize yourself with our program for today. And I think we will just have like a minute or two to wait for other people to join. So while we're waiting, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them.
I don't want to bother our international colleagues, but we really want to know if you see us and hear us clearly. Please share in chat or say by voice, because we are not sure that everything is technically ideal.
So I see one sign that everything works. So perhaps we can start. What do you think, Eva?
Yep. I also think if there were any problems, we would have already heard about them. So yes, I would love to start by giving the word to the founder of our research group, Arseniy Kumanikov.
So good evening, everyone, once again. And actually, I think that my speech is almost unnecessary after Eva's introduction, because I was going to say a few words about our group. As such, I will add something to the speech of Eva. And after that, my colleagues will share the results of the first year of our joint work. So for the beginning, I would also like to say a few words about the group itself, because it could be useful for our international students, so they could know about such an opportunity to create such a group. So we have an HSE university such a project that supports the creation of groups, gathering students and professors who work on a specific subject together for 1 year or 2 years. It depends how good do you work during the first year. So all of you have a chance to participate in such competition maybe next year. And me and Professor Kashnikov, who is also here now, we had in the past such an experience of making a group with international PhD student, I guess, or student. So our first group on the philosophy of war. So there was one international student who joined our first group on philosophy of war. So this is a chance that you can use, and you can try to make to build such a collaboration with other students, with your professors. This competition takes place every year in September usually, so take a chance. As Eva has already said, our mission, our group is focused on the Soviet theory of war, and since the subject itself is rather broad, and since all of us are philosophers, our main focus is ethics of war, as it appeared to be in the first decades of the existence of Soviet state. So I can. What was so there are different subjects and different problems that are important for us. There are different questions that we would like to check and to understand better. Some of them are the questions of what was the main problems of ethics of war discussed in different layers of Soviet state. What was the what was sorry, I'm on the book fair. So what was the just cause for war? What was what appeared to be the just war for the Bolsheviks, rhetoric as such. So we also concentrated on the problem what means for allowed in war, and from the point of view of different politicians, military leaders, historians, philosophers engaged in the work of the Soviet state. I think that only this joint perspective on war and on the ethics of Soviet war allows us to understand better the perception of justice of war as such. Of course, that is uneasy to gather and to collect and to find quality of resources of that period. That is mostly due to the predominance of Leninism and then of Stalinism in different fields of Soviet public discussion, of Soviet science, of Soviet intellectual life. And I believe that our concentration on the first years of the existence of Soviet state can allows us to get some interesting ideas and to find
Arseniy Dmitrievich, I think we lost your signal. Yeah, we definitely lost it.
Okay, so sadly we have some technical difficulties on one of the ends. It happens. As was previously mentioned, our work, due to its complexity and intricacy of the entire concept of ethics of war, consisted of 4 areas of research. And here today, we have Professor Dr. Boris Kashnikov, that was the head of the notions of terror and terrorism in Soviet thought section of research. So now I will give the word to Dr. Kashnikov.
Boris Nikolaevich,
Yes, I see. Thank you, Eva. So, one substantial part of our research is related to what we call terrorism and terror. And well, there is no denial of the fact that terrorism makes very significant issue. And the methods of terrorism were widely discussed in Russian thought before the revolution, and terrorism and terror was implemented to the great extent in Soviet politics. So the research itself is taking place on both conceptual and practical issues of terrorism. First of all, the starting point for our research would be the understanding of terrorism, which we find in Grotius. According to Grotius, terrorism is a necessary and inevitable part of war. So war consists of two indispensable parts. One part is force, the second part is terror. And there is no way to eliminate it completely in any war at any times. At certain moments of history, the element of terrorism was reduced rather considerably. This was especially true about Clausewitz, whom we also discussed, because for Clausewitz, terrorism, of course, is not necessary and inevitable part of war, although, of course, Clausewitz at the same time takes into consideration the possibility of the so-called absolute war. And what is absolute war? When absolute war occurs, everything is possible and everything is happening at this war, including elements of terror. So we can regard terrorism as that element of war which is striving for absolute war. At the same time, absolute war is not exactly the war which are totally deprived, or absolutely deprived, so to say, absolutely deprived of all elements of constraint. We have to take into consideration also some works by Kant, including his Perpetual Peace, where he gives very significant consideration on what makes war and possible limitations on war. So when it comes to Soviet period, we of course have to take into account what preceded the Soviet period, namely the pre-revolutionary period. And the element of terrorism which was taking place in this period was very significant, to the extent that many researchers even claimed that Russian terrorism of the late 19th century was a paradigmatic one. So in a way, it was paradigmatic in European history, so that the history of European terrorism of the late 19th century should be regarded to the great extent as predetermined by Russian terrorist struggle. And well, although terrorism, of course, is eternal element of war, but it became significantly acute, and it became on starkest display after the Great French Revolution due to many circumstances. One of these circumstances was the engagement or the involvement of the masses, of the multitude, the voice of the multitude. That is exactly what Clausewitz predicted when he mentioned that the engagement of the masses, the element of, he didn't call it terror, he called passion. The element of passion becomes very acute, and the possibility of limitation of war becomes less possible. So with this considerable change, and especially with the engagement of mass media, the element of terrorism gained its second breath. And in the Russian struggle, in the struggle of the Russian people's will, the revolutionary organization, the element of terror became so significant that nothing else was really of much importance. And especially with the emergence of socialist revolution, the revolutionaries. We have to mention here at least one significant name, that is Nikolai Marossa. His remarkable book, which I highly recommend you to read, strictly speaking, it's not a book, but a brochure. It is entitled On Terror War. In this book, he made very important considerations. And one of these considerations is remarkable in a way. It is the consideration that terror war or terror struggle is the most humane of all possible ways of struggle. You may ask how so, but the answer is quite clear. It is so simply because for socialist revolutionaries, terrorism was regarded as individual terrorism, as attack of individual bureaucrats or military leaders of the empire who were engaged in certain crimes against the masses. So the way to eliminate these particular individuals, and that was individual terrorism because of that, was supposed to be a humane way. And it was also considered to be even less than terrorism, but execution. The execution of the criminals who committed crimes against the masses. And this kind of terrorist activity was taking place at very remarkable extent, so that at certain moments, up to 100 bureaucrats were executed monthly. And it really made the empire tremble. And the goal was exactly to kill two birds with one stone. One stone was to inflict terror on the officials. The other goal was to awake the masses from their slumber. With these two goals accomplished, the revolution will be at hand. And it happened so. The revolution, to the great extent, the revolution of 1917 and forward 1905, was predetermined to the great extent by this activity, although it was committed by Bolsheviks, not by socialist revolutions. And then it is the time of another stage in the development of the notion of terrorism and terrorism itself. The Bolsheviks, in fact, were always very close to socialist revolutions. Nikolai Marossa, whom I mentioned, was not a Bolshevik, of course, but he was probably one of very few socialist revolutionaries who were not executed by Bolsheviks after the revolution. He lived up to 90 years and always remained one of the people whom Stalin respected very much, probably taking lessons from him. We may also say that at this point, the nature of terrorism or the form of terrorism has been changed, because the Soviet government also switched to terrorism shortly. Only it was not individual terrorism or individual, but in another way. It was massive terrorism. It was massive terrorism, and it was state terrorism, what is most important, because before it was, of course, the terrorism of the groups. Now it was state terrorism. Soviet government switched to state terrorism against the former oppressive classes. And there is no denial of the fact that these oppressive classes were defined very broadly. In fact, everyone could be regarded as a member of the oppressive classes. And the most particular goal of this massive terrorism, of which we know, of course, very well, the outbreak and the summit of this terrorism, which took place in 1937. The amount of this terrorism and the amount of victims of this terrorism was so remarkable, although I do not quite remember the exact figures, but in one day, in one of the days of 1937, the amount of executed people exceeded the amount of all the political opponents executed by the Tsarist government in 100 years. So you can just imagine, with all the slogans which were characteristic of communists, that the former or the Tsarist regime was oppressive, and it is these figures just make a mockery of this claim, no doubt. So we can claim at this point that individual terrorism can be very easily transformed into state terrorism, which is why these simplifications, which are quite characteristic of terrorism, that terrorism is one of the possible definitions where it is claimed that terrorism is necessary terrorism of the groups, or that terrorism is necessary a kind of violence which is waged without constraints. On the contrary, the history of Russian terrorism makes it absolutely clear that there are no there are no tight line between state terrorism and terrorism of the groups. They can go this or that direction, and one can switch into another and the other way around. We could see the same in Chechnya, because, well, Chechnya is of course also part of terrorism, but that would be the third stage of the development and history of terrorism in Russia. And the second claim, which I believe mentioned before, is that terrorism which is necessary unconstrained. On the contrary, terrorism could be highly constrained. In fact, it could be much more constrained than it is possible in war. It is much easier, in fact, to achieve constraint war when it is terror war, because it's much more easier to be proportional. It is much more easier to be distinctive when it comes to terrorism. Terrorism, in fact, may be very distinctive and may be very proportional, which is why we should not really understand terrorism as some kind of violence which is not constrained. On the contrary, we should understand terrorism as paradigmatic violence, which could be much more constrained, much more subtle, much more and even devilish. Well, at this point, I would highly recommend you to read the book by Dostoevsky, his groundbreaking The Possessed, which you know, Bese. And one of the monologues of paradigmatic terrorists, Piotr Verhovensky, in this novel is quite characteristic. He mentions at a certain point that the real task and the real goal of the revolutionary is to make people not only suffer, but to make people submissive to you. To make people submissive to you. That is the secret goal of terrorists. And of course, this goal could be accomplished much better if it is a terrorism which is a constrained one, constrained terrorism. Well,
Thank you so much, Dr. Kashnikov. I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's just we have to elaborate on things that you just said, and the next presentation is by Daniil Lavreeshev, who was a part of Dr. Kashnikov's sub-research group within our big research group. So now I would ask Daniil to start his presentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you,
Excuse
Yeva.
me, Yeva, for violating the time frame.
It's okay.
You didn't tell me the time frame.
It was a really great introduction. Thank you, Boris Nikolaevich. And so the first thing I would like to mention is that the research about terrorism in our research group is divided into two branches. The first branch is presented by me, and my general aim and focus was on terror justification procedures and practices in early Soviet Union, especially before the year 1928. So in my investigations, I tried to find out some specific justification arguments and defensive procedures which Soviet ideological and political leaders tried to use in publicity, especially in some philosophical texts or maybe in papers, in speech, and so on. And the second way here of the research on terror was the problem of national liberation terrorism, which is presented by Eva Pogosyan, who is our moderator. So I think, Eva, we can switch to the next slide, and I will present my part of the work. As you can see, here is the timeline, and I think that results of my work are neatly presented by this picture. So the first thing I would like to say is that my investigations, especially restricted by 1900 and 1928 years. And 1900 is the quite usable year to start because there finished, to say, decay of something I'd like to call old revolutionaries. So it's the Народная воля party or some early revolutionaries in the end of 19th century. And in 1900, it started to form the new so-called terror theory. And such theory is represented by Social Democratist Party and Social Revolutionaries Party. And my primary focus in this period was on the figures of Lenin and Plekhanov, because they are, according to my hypothesis, ones of the most influential members of Social Democratic Party, and they are strongly connected to the revolution of 1917. And the main line in the discussion between 1900 and 1917 is focusing on the problem of individual terror, as Boris Nikolaevich have mentioned before. And both Bukharin and Lenin say that individual terror is inappropriate, the destructive and wrong way of revolutionary fighting. And here, the 1917 is the turning point for, say, general party line about terrorism. And during the events of revolution in 1917 were formed mostly common for the further theory of terrorism. There formed some arguments, and most of them are formulated by Lenin, but some of them we can find it in the texts of Bukharin and just partly in the works of Trotsky. So there are four general arguments which are characterizing the thing I call Lenin's theory of terror. And first of such foundations in this theory is the Marxist theory aspects, especially the thesis that every revolution necessarily concludes terror and terrorism in itself. And the Russian Revolution of 1917 is not an exclusion. So in the Russian Revolution, we also face terror in some ways and need some instruments and some practices to work with it. And the second foundation of such theory is the special understanding of justice. And the understanding of justice in Lenin's theory is based on eye for an eye principle. And it is translated to the class fighting as the fight between proletarians and bourgeoisie. So the proletarians have suffered so long from the oppression of bourgeoisie. So we have justified and true right to strike back and practice some terror on the bourgeoisie class. The third thing should mention here is the state safety argument. And the state safety argument is that the new Soviet state should be kept safe and sound, because it's just the first socialistic state which is suppressed by capitalistic opponents. And the terror could be one of the ways to protect such state from inside. And the connected to the safe state safety thing is party-controlled terror. It's an argument where Lenin said that according to Marxist theory, we should control the usage of terror and try to make it less chaotic and destructive, and try to make it more positive and positive in the meaning of productive and more organized and controlled. So such arguments, according to my hypothesis, are somehow inherited in the line of terrorism investigations in Soviet Union before the year 1928, where started to form the Stalin theory of terror. And one thing I should mention there is the year 1921, where started economic changes, and the main of them is the start of new economic policy, so-called NEP, where the terror victims were changed from white army or capitalists to ideological opponents like Church or kulaks. And as I have mentioned before, in the year 1928, there started to form Stalin's theory of terror. So my general aim and the most ambitious aim, I think, is to find out how the arguments I found in Lenin, and yes, thank you, Vlad, and the arguments I find in Stalin should transform in, let's say, further theory of terror in the Eastern Europe, in the last years of Soviet states, and in the Cold War. So now I should give the word to Eva, and she will tell you about her part of the research in the subject of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. My research was intertwined with the whole concept of terrorism and terror. And one of the reasons I became interested in this topic is the sheer ambiguity of the entire notion of terrorism. Nowadays, through the spread of modern technology and communication, terror has become globalized. Everyone is a target, both to be a victim of a terrorist attack and of being politically labeled as a terrorist. Our research group provided the necessary historical context to my research, focusing on the beginning of the 20th century and the groundwork that went into the definition of terrorism in Soviet Union. During the course of our in-group reading seminars, specifically the one held on the June 11th, thanks to Daniil's theoretical groundwork, we uncovered Vladimir Lenin's personal view on terror and terrorism. According to his writings, Lenin perceived terror as a means of achieving goals, but had a strict rejection of individualistic terror that existed before the Soviet rule. So there is no universal definition of terrorism, but it is possible to formulate various brands of terrorism, if you will. Hence the reason of distinguishing terrorism of national liberation into a separate notion. As our time is very limited, I will have to refer you to an article by Dr. Kashnikov, namely the nature of terroristic acts. It is available via the Higher School of Economics website, although only in Russian, well, for the time being at least. And I will later make an email blast with all the links that might be of interest to you. So moving on to my case study, one of the most important aspects to consider was the historical context of pre-Soviet Armenia. History of each and every Soviet republic is valuable as any other, and they all played a significant role in the political landscape of the USSR. So here, pre-Soviet Armenia offers one of the most let's say, peculiar cases in contemporary terrorism of national liberation. Not going too deep in the discussion about Armenian genocide, it is essential to understand the volume of destruction that left the entire nation and diaspora in ruins. The universal feeling of loss led to the rise of a national liberation movement throughout the diaspora. There were hopes of support from the rising new communist regime in Russia, as the previously imperialistic system proved no support. But the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had drastic consequences for the Armenians because Turkish forces reoccupied Western Armenia. When the Turkish-Armenian War started in autumn 1920, Armenia was isolated and abandoned by Western allies. The newly formed League of Nations did not prove any help, and Soviet Russia intensified its pressure on Armenia. Losing the war, Armenia signed the Treaty of Alexandropol on the 2nd of December of 1920, which resulted in the recognition of large territorial losses to Turkey. Despite their tight grip on power, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation ceded power to the Communist Army troops invading from the north, which culminated with a Soviet takeover. Now, let's talk about revenge. The Operation Nemesis was masterminded and carried out by a cell of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. The main goal of the operation was assassination of those responsible for the Armenian genocide. The leader of the group responsible for the task was Shahan Natali, working with Grigor Mirjanov. For Natalie, the primary target was Talat Pasha, whom Shahan called number one, as in the number one target. The mission to kill Talat was entrusted to Soghomon Tehlirian. Natalie's aim was to turn Tehlirian's trial into the political trial of those responsible for the Armenian genocide. Tehlirian was, of course, tried for murder in Berlin. That was in the aftermath of the newly established Weimar Republic. The trial examined not only Tehlirian's actions, but also Tehlirian's conviction that Talat was the main actor and author of the Armenian deportation and mass killings. The defense attorneys made no attempt to deny the fact that Tehlirian had killed a man, and instead focused on the influence of the Armenian genocide on Tehlirian's mental state. As it was, Tehlirian was a direct victim of mass murders of the genocide, with his entire family executed before his eyes and him being deported after the fact. After being questioned on any feeling of remorse or guilt, Tehlirian said the following, I quote, "I do not consider myself guilty because my conscience is clear. I have killed a man, but I am not a murderer." So, not that long after, the 12-man jury rendered Tehlirian not guilty. This trial was marked as unprecedented and inspired journalists and philosophers to reflect on it. To quote journalist Emil Ludwig, only when a society of nations has organized itself as the protector of internal order will no Armenian killer remain unpunished, because no Turkish pasha has the right to send a nation into the desert. Also, Hannah Arendt mentioned Tehlirian in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, but the book itself deserves numerous separate discussions, so we will move on. So, to conclude, one might categorize this case as a precedent of poetic justice. I myself prefer to put it in the discourse of separate categorization of terrorism of national liberation. So why do we create a different category for terrorism of national liberation? Because the most effective way of giving any action an ethical or historical evaluation is through definition of causes. What causes are there to terrorism, you might ask? Why do groups commit terrorist acts? Because getting their grievances heard through regular channels hasn't worked. So to them, terrorism is the only way to be heard. Terrorism is an expression of anger and helplessness, and also a sense of betrayal. It is the one last shot at achieving justice in a system that does not provide it unless the goal has an economic or political benefit. And that is it on my work that once again could not have been possible if not for our research group. Thank you for your attention. I now realize that the visual presentation should have been flashier, but oh well, next time. So now I believe we have time for questions. So if you, well, for one question, if you have a question, please raise your hand via the raise your hand option in Zoom. If you don't have any questions, we will move on.
Yes, I do have one question. Yeah, I found extremely interesting what Boris Nikolaevich was telling at the start, and I know that we didn't have time because we moved to another part. And so is it possible before we move to the new part on cloud suites to hear what he wanted to say? Because I think he didn't say everything he planned to.
Of course, if Dr. Kashnikov would like to continue, please.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid it will take too long if I continue. And well, we may talk of it later and find special time for that. I conceptualized what I thought of terrorism, but of course I didn't finish everything I would like to say. So we better switch to Yeva again and then continue the line.
In the end of our presentation, we will give you the necessary contact information. If you are interested in contacting any one of us, we would love to continue the conversation. Yes, Daria.
And I would like to ask, when we are talking about terrorism and terror today, do we speak about the same terror as they in USSR spoke or not? Or if they are different terrorisms and terror today and a century ago?
Is this question directed to Daniil or me or both of us?
I guess the group worked on this very topic, so everyone's free to answer. I would love to discuss that topic. But maybe later in the end of our discussion.
Well, if Dr. Kashnikov or Daniil would like to answer this question, please go ahead. Otherwise, I can insert my 2 cents in the conversation.
I will just make it clear. When we are talking about terrorism today, I suppose that it's much different than terrorism and terror a century ago. in the early 20s of USSR. So when we try to interpret what theoreticians thought about, terror in USSR in 2030s of 20th century, we are just thinking about the different concepts.
Yes, let me try to answer. That is very correct. The question, of course, is very correct. There is nothing in common. It is truly so between Russian individual terrorism and the terrorism, say, of Al-Qaeda. It's absolutely different things, absolutely different entities. And it is hard to see what exactly is in common of this terrorism, which is why it is the problem for the definition of terrorism. All definitions of terrorism fail simply because there is nothing in common of these terrorisms. They are all called terrorisms, but they're nothing which could work as a ground for the definition. That is a problem for these possible definitions. And well, in 19th century in Russia, it was, well, the terrorists were proud of being terrorists, and they were willing to be called terrorists. Not now. Now they try to conceal their hideous actions. But I believe it is still possible to find a common ground for all these terrorisms. But it is a matter of very significant research effort. I know how to do that, but I will not tell now. It is, otherwise we will lose the incentive.
Yeah, I think we are the research group, so we must find the methods ourselves. Thank you, Professor.
We will have to find it. I have some ideas about that, but it is a matter of very serious research yet.
Yeah,
so it is still possible. It is still possible to find the common ground, and we must work in this direction.
Yeah, thank you.
And then one last question. Could you please just re-explain why terrorism, there is more boundaries to terrorism than war in general? I think it's what you said. There are more limits to terrorism or something like this.
More what? Say it again, please.
Like limits or boundaries to terrorism.
Distinctions.
No, I think that you... Limitation, maybe the word. Yeah, you said
constraints. Yes. What we call constraints. It is not exactly what I meant. I simply mentioned that terrorism, in principle, not necessary in practice, could be much more constrained in terms of these well-known principles of use in bello, proportionality and distinction. So it is much easier for a terrorist to stick to these principles, simply because it is very strict and very clear-cut action. War may be regarded, or the waging of war may be regarded as, well, as an elephant in China store. When war is waged, everything is damaged. But terrorists acts as a surgeon. He may do some surgical operation, eliminated this or that individual, and do it exclusively artfully, which is why terrorism, strictly speaking, may be more constrained.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your answers and for such interesting questions, because they really quite encompass what we do here in our group. So now I would love to move to the next section of our research, presented by one of the senior members of our study group, senior lecturer at the Faculty of Humanities, Roman Gulaev.
Thank you, Eva. Good evening, colleagues. Today I will present the results of the research of our group. It so happened that our group consisted of one person in the end, it was me, but I must mention a major contributor to the research on this topic, an independent researcher, Igor Sokolov, whose report took place on one of our first seminars, and I will present the main thesis of that discussion, and then add some points of my own development on the topic. So Eva, can we begin with the first slide, please? Thank you. My topic concludes the history of Soviet reception on a Prussian war theorist, Karl von Clausewitz, whom you may see on the picture. Quite a good-looking young man, I must say. In some way, we can say that history of Soviet approach to Clausewitz and his theory resembles the history of change of Soviet approach to war itself. Those two stories relate to each other. I think that all of us know the main thesis of Clausewitz's work on war, his definition of war as a mere continuation of policy by other means. But to be honest, I think everyone knows the definition, and this definition in itself looks more like maybe some bon mot or some catchphrase or slogan or something like that. But Clausewitz provides more in his work. It must be mentioned that Clausewitz addresses his book not only to professional militaries who might know most of his thesis from their own experience, but in the first place, he addresses to those who try to understand war as a specific type of human activity, and who try to understand an army as a specific human institution, which is dedicated to that activity. To those, he formulates another definition and explains that definition. This is the second definition on this slide. War is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. And to that definition, he adds that war is always a serious means for serious objects, and that war should always be treated as such serious means. War is not a journey or adventure or something like that. Without such definition, we cannot truly and correctly understand the history of a particular war or particular battle. Clausewitz adds that such a serious process is provided with something that he calls friction. He tells that even the simplest action in the war is not simple, because every action, every decision consists of not only of the will of a person who conducts this action, but is also followed by a sense of danger, by physical efforts, by uncertainty, and by chance. And those four factors influence psychology, actions, decisions of every participant of a military campaign, from the general to the private soldier. those factors cannot be taken out of consideration when we try to understand the events of particular battle or particular campaign. And Clausewitz adds that because of these factors, war is only partially controllable process. It always includes an element of unpredictability and chaos. And that side, that combatant, which minimizes the effect of this chaos, this unpredictability, will be victorious at the end. Next slide, please. But Clausewitz isn't very popular in Imperial Russia before the 1917. His theoretic works aren't properly translated into Russian. His research on Russian military history, because he has books dedicated to campaigns of Alexander Suvorov in Italy, major book on the war of 1812 against Napoleon, in which he took part as a volunteer. Those works are mostly neglected as dry and boring. And if you have read novel War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, he is an episodic and quite unpleasant character of that book. But there is a keen and avid reader of Clausewitz. It is Vladimir Lenin. He is accustomed to Clausewitz's work on war around 1915 during the First World War. He takes notes, he makes comments on this book, but he reads this as a politician, not as a war theorist. He is more focused on a connection between politics and war, not by Clausewitz's view on characteristics of war itself. But the first years of Soviet state put to power some former junior and middle rank officers of Russian Imperial Army of the Tsarist period. Such authors as Alexander Svechin, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Boris Shaposhnikov, they all are making the new military force from scratch, because of course Red Army only in some parts resembles the previous army of Tsarist Russia. And those persons mostly are real enthusiasts of war. They are interested in all its aspects, and they view it not only as a profession, but as a way of life. And those theorists find the Soviet Union in a difficult situation because it has no allies, it lacks technology and industry, and it must be able to compete with bourgeois powers which surround it. So they think something like that. We must study bourgeois military doctrines, military history, and their ideas. And based on those views and doctrines, we must develop our own. The sphere of thought in where Soviet Union can close the gap or even gain upper hand on its adversaries, and the sphere of thought is more easily achievable than in sphere of production and the industry, for example. And for these goals, Clausewitz makes a very important material. His works are properly translated and published by Voyenizdat Publishing House, which is run by Ministry of Defense. Starting from 1924 and to 1941, most major works of Clausewitz are translated, commented, and are published to be accessible to most Soviet officers and citizens. Also, there is a discussion on his view of war and how to interpret his concepts. This discussion runs in specified journals, for example, as Military Thought or Военная мысль in Russian journal, Foreign Military Review, and others. There lies a discussion on how Soviets and foreign authors view war, view Clausewitz, what are actual comments on his works, etc. But most of those authors are being repressed and killed during the Great Purge of Red Army in 1937-38. And the main military theorist of Soviet Union and the main authority in this sphere becomes Joseph Stalin himself. Some research still continue, but in 1941 and after that, during war, there is not much time and resources for academic research and discussion. And Soviet Clausewitz studies stalled until the end of war. Next slide, please. And in 1946, Stalin answers to a personal letter addressed to him by Colonel Razin, who is a professor in Soviet Military Academy. Razin asks Stalin, how must we interpret Clausewitz today after the war has finished? Is he still a relevant author for us? And Stalin answers that part of his answer you may see on the slides, but in short, Stalin answers that Clausewitz belongs to a Prussian military tradition, which has been defeated in 2 world wars. His views are now obsolete, and we have nothing to study from him from now on. And this view, in fact, still exists even after Stalin's death in 1953. And such a view influences the Soviet history of Second World War as it is developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I must say that Soviet history, official history of war, looks quite inconsistent and patchy to me, because it tries to avoid some difficult topics, such as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which influenced the beginning of the Second World War, Stalin's purges of the army, major defeats during the war, inefficient military command, which contributed to those defeats, the superior number of losses, prisoners of war, collaborators, and so on. While trying to avoid those topics, Soviet history of war concentrates on several successful operations. For example, Battle for Moscow, Battle for Stalingrad, Battle for Kursk, Operation Bagration, and Berlin. So Soviet history of war, which is presented to general public and researchers as well, is some kind of several victories which lie in vacuum, because what happened between those battles, what happened on other parts of front at that time, those topics are being shaded and lied beneath discussion. So the history of Second World War looks as heroic deeds, sacrifices of Soviet people, but it is put as abstract as possible. It can be described as a generalization and simplification of a complex process, which war is. And the Soviet approach, in most cases, produces myth instead of an academic research, or at least instead of a reflection on real experience. And next slide, please. Thank you. And in this case, I would like to address to a modern American researcher of Soviet cinema, Denis Youngblood, who in some of her researches formulates the following thesis, that Soviet cinema directors had more freedom than academic researchers of war. And they work with images, not with the words. And with those images, they try to present a more adequate and deep reflection of what war is and what war experience is. Youngblood divides Soviet cinema tradition on war in two major groups. First tradition is an epic social realist films, which began even before the war, because, for example, Alexander Nevsky by Sergei Eisenstein, Fall of Berlin of 1949, the Liberation trilogy by Ozerov in 1970s. Those are epic, high-scale, high-emotion war films, which present a grand scope of things. And the second tradition are so-called quiet war films. For example, The Cranes Are Flying of 1957, The Ballad of Soldier, 1959, Ivan's Childhood by Andrei Tarkovsky of 1962, etc. Those films concentrate on human feelings. They do not try to tell a grand scope story, but they concentrate on some local actions, some local groups of people, their feelings, their traumatizing experience, etc. For those films, war is simply a background which influences on the human stories, but it is not very interesting for those authors by itself. And the film, which, as I see it, concludes those two lines and provides a link with the pre-war studies of Clausewitz, is the film on the second slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. The film Come and See by Elem Klimov. Youngblood sees this as an apocalyptic movie, and if you have seen it, I think you get the impression, because this is the film when war is separated of any heroism, of any adventure, is demonstrated as a traumatizing and very brutal experience. Youngblood thinks that this film, in its ideology, prolongs, continues the previous tradition of Soviet reception of war, because it demonstrates the demonic, inhuman Germans who torture and kill civil populace. It concentrates on sacrifice and suffering of Soviet people, etc. I must say that this film, for I think every viewer, looks tedious. It feels much longer than its 2 hours length, and it is very scary, because and not only scary in kind of body horror, because we see very graphic and brutal suffering of human beings, but it is scary because in long periods of time nothing happens, when things do happen, they happen very suddenly and very shockingly. This film is very meticulous and precise in depicting, in the first place, the special effects of war. For example, it uses live ammunition, it borderline ignores safety standards when we really fear for actors who get under fire from real guns. It is very innovating in its visual and sound design. It influenced a lot on the cinema language of major Hollywood productions, for example, Saving Private Ryan from Steven Spielberg and other cinemas. But as well, this film is very meticulous in depicting uniforms, insignia, appearance, and behavior of combatants. And it must be mentioned that it depicts combatants from both sides. It mostly looks like a visual encyclopedia on a level of detail and research which is put into the appearance of every even minor characters. We see internal and external transformation of a protagonist, young Belarusian guy Flora, who joins the partisans. In the upper part, you can see him before as young and innocent and intrigued by war. In the lower part, this is him at the end of the movie. He is visually aged, devastated, and transformed by this experience. But the movie focuses not only on this transformation of a hero who starts as a foreigner to war, who doesn't know and doesn't understand what is happening around him, and little by little gets used to it, and in the end, he is overwhelmed and totally crushed by the war as an experience, as a form of activity. But these films, if we try to analyze how this effect, which is present not only on a protagonist, but on the audience as well, because we also end this movie physically, mentally beaten and exhausted. If we analyze how this effect is achieved, we can see definitely 4 elements of Clausewitz's atmosphere of war, which I mentioned in the beginning of my speech. The elements of danger, physical effort, uncertainty, and chance. Unfortunately, we do not have time and opportunity to present how those effects, those elements are constructed during the film. But all of them are the main factors which contribute to the aging and transformation of a main hero. And it must be mentioned that Clausewitz is directly mentioned in the novel Chestners by the screenwriter of this movie, Alessia Damovich. The novel which in most cases, this movie is a screening of that novel, and Clausewitz is mentioned then in that book, and Adamovich seems to be a very interested reader of Clausewitz and his view on war itself. So we can say that when Soviet society meets direct possibility of war, in 1930s, it is the first time, and the 1980s, when Cold War is at its peak, and it must be mentioned that also the war in Afghanistan proceeds at that time. And at those times, Clausewitz provides productive approach for Soviet society, an approach to war as a serious means for a serious object. And that would be the conclusion of my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was, wow, I did not expect to also get an introspect into, well, such deep introspect into cinematography. Okay, so we have time for one question. If anyone has, then just raise your hand via the raise your hand option. If not, then I think we can safely move on to, yes, Daria, you have a question?
Well,
Daria, fortunately, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sure we can discuss it later, but just to think about, you mentioned that Clausewitz is actively translated and commented and published until 1941. Is the Soviet finish the Winter War analyzed through the prism of Clausewitz or not?
I think that Clausewitz is not used as a means to analyze the real conflicts in which Soviet Union participates. It would be, it may be a framework which was possible for the generation of Tukhachevsky and others, but they are long dead at the beginning of the Finnish War, and those who take their place, they are not in such familiarity and level of information into Clausewitz as they were. Maybe there would be a generation which could follow these logics, but unfortunately there wasn't.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, if there are no other questions, we are moving on to the next segment that is presented by my colleagues, Dmitry Maleev and Vlad Gaiduk. Guys, you can take away from here.
Thank you. Now, good evening. We will talk about the formation of the idea of the right of nations to self-determination in the Soviet thought through the polemic of the Bolsheviks and Austro-Marxists. The idea of national self-determination in the form in which it is present in modern international law began to develop precisely in the writings of the Bolsheviks. They argued precisely with Austro-Marxists, so we chose exactly these two opposites in order to analyze how the idea of national self-determination was formed. In this research, we wanted to answer the following questions. What is a nation and how can we understand whether this community is a nation? Is the right of nations to self-determination absolute or not? What will the future socialistic world look like? Will there be nations there? We used articles and books devoted to theoretical and practical aspects of the issue. I will talk about Austro-Marxism and my comrade about the Bolsheviks. But first, I will mention Marx and Engels. Next slide, please. Marx and Engels, as we know from the manifesto of the Communist Party, say that the communist world is an international world. A nation is a product of the capitalistic era. It appeared because the bourgeoisie, the struggle against feudal lords, united to the scattered regions and people. But in the middle of the 19th century, the bourgeoisie had already almost entered the international level. National borders began to disappear. Class struggle became the mainstream. The proletariat realized itself as a class. However, this happened only in the advanced capitalistic countries of Western Europe. In the rest of the world, not all nations have formed. Not all have reached this level. since the issue of national self-determination is thus applicable only to the lagging nations, it acquired a strategic character. In other words, Marx and Engels did not seek to develop a theoretical basis for it, but considered it in the light of the movement of the world towards communism. We will struggle to liberate this particular nation, be a hindrance. If so, we should not fight. Everyone will be free under communism. The Polish and Irish nations should be liberated. The Balkan nations, for example, and some European nations should not. Next slide, please. The detailed elaboration of this issue began in a country where national conflicts were the main political issue, in Austria. The first theorists were Otto Bauer and Karl Renner. They understood the nation as a community of culture and character arising on the basis of a community of fate. On the basis of this definition, they put forward the concept of national cultural autonomy. What does it mean? It means that we will solve the problem by dividing the country according to two principles: administrative, economic, and personal. In other words, we form districts according to economic and administrative considerations. Where possible, they should coincide with national borders. This is how we divide about 90% of the country. The remaining 10% will not coincide with one particular nation, but this is not necessary. The nation is united not on a territorial basis, but on a personal basis. That is, people create national organizations in which they solve issues of national culture and language. This is national self-determination. This is consistent with this definition of nations. If a nation is a community of character and it has nothing to do with territory and economy, then freedom in resolving cultural issues is sufficient for its liberation. Every member of the nation can participate in it in every district, and political issues will be resolved in the country center. Thus, Bauer and Renner believe that the Austro-Hungarian Empire can be preserved. However, in this way, they only strengthen national differences, as Stalin wrote about, but for them, it should be so, because the socialist world is a world of free nations. The nations will always exist and will not disappear anywhere. Next slide, please. Karl Kautsky takes a slightly different position. The key criterion of the nation for him is language. Territory and unity of production are also important, but they're secondary. According to his hypothesis, nationalism develops simultaneously with internationalism. Certain classes of society, merchants, scientists, aristocrats, are constantly in contact with other nations and begin to create a common space with several common languages. In Europe, they're English, German, and French. At the same time, peasants and workers who are engaged in production don't need to communicate with other nations. Therefore, they only develop their own language, but they demand their national culture, schools, newspapers, and so on. So they develop nationalism. Freedom of nations, according to Kautsky, is possible only under socialism. However, we must not fight for the liberation of nations in the full sense of the word. Everything is subordinated to the interests of a socialist society. Under socialism, we can apply the principle of national cultural autonomy. The socialist world is the world of the United States of Europe, United States of Russia, United States of America, and so on. Nations in them are free because they solve their own cultural issues, but work together as a single organism in economic and political issues. As we remember, this corresponds to the definition of nations through language. However, this is not the limit. The world is gradually moving towards complete internationalism. The task of social democrats is to raise the peasants and workers to the level of merchants, scientists, and aristocrats, to teach them world culture and languages. And over time, we will come to one culture and one language without nations. This culture and this language maybe will be English culture and English language. What?
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. So I will talk about Bolsheviks and their view on nations. We were studying this theme, and I would be pleased to show you some results. We tried to find the reason behind the importance of the nation and the Bolsheviks' ideology, its role in the war. So I would like to present what we found. During 1900s, there were a lot of bourgeois democratic revolutions, and different national movements emerged. Russia needed to look at the events and understand the meaning behind the word nation. Basically, it is widely known that Bolsheviks were trying to establish a society without nations and classes. That would mean that nations are the enemies of communism. However, that is a wrong assumption. Nation is a byproduct of capitalism. However, it doesn't mean that it is impossible to cooperate with them, because nations are always competing against each other, and losing nations become oppressed. Ireland, for example. Oppressed nation is a nation that is unable to achieve independence and build their own country. However, they have the potential to do this, but they are unable to realize this potential. They are unable to do so because other nations use them to increase their own capital. The Bolsheviks must cooperate with oppressed nations in order to achieve their objective, to eliminate the bourgeoisie. Lenin was one of the first Bolsheviks who decided to take this route, and in 1930, his work, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, was published. Another important person at that time was Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, but this is a question for another day. In this and other of his works, he stated that the right to self-determination is a right to separate and become independent. So what about other nations? The Bolsheviks should support oppressed nations because they are future allies. However, not all nations should separate, because only the Communist Party should decide the fate of a nation. Lenin wanted to have a centralized and powerful party, and was ready to eliminate all threats to his objectives. The Bolsheviks thought that every nation must have the right to self-determination, but not all of them should use it. Only the Communist Party can decide if a nation should separate or not. So it means that, for example, if a nation is useful in the fight with capitalism, then they can separate and become future allies. Otherwise, the party will decide this nation's fate. It is important because the Bolsheviks couldn't forget their main objective, which is an international society. Lenin's ideas were powerful and influenced others, and soon Stalin, Trotsky, Bukharin, Schauman shared his ideology. It is important to mention that Bukharin and Schauman thought that it is dangerous to be involved with the nation and capitalism, so Lenin decided to convince them otherwise. However, we saw that Lenin did not write much about what he considered to be a nation. Next slide, please. That's why we decided to look at the works of another famous person, Joseph Stalin. Stalin's propositions from his work, Marxism and the National Question, were very important as well. He chose 4 criteria to define a nation. So, a nation is a group of people that fulfills all of these criteria. These criteria are common language, common territory, common economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. The Bolsheviks thought that cultural autonomy, which was used by Austro-Marxism, led to a disunity of a nation. So Stalin proposed another way in the form of territorial autonomy. This concept presupposes that a certain developed territory, for example, Poland, Ukraine, etc., will become autonomous, and all nations inside of this territory will start living together and make decisions without consulting the center. But these decisions will, of course, need to benefit the center. This also means that lesser nationalities that were underdeveloped did not have the right to self-determination. They needed to join a bigger nation. And also that meant that Jews and different small groups, or not very small group, were not considered a nation, as they did not fulfill the criteria. Why Jews are not considered a nation? This is a complicated political question, but there is an answer to it, and to fight it, we decided to look more at the surroundings. At that time, there was a big Jewish organization called Bund inside the party. As it was one of the biggest, it was somewhat independent in certain areas. This was a big obstacle towards centralization of the party. However, the right of nations to self-determination would pose a threat to the unity of the Bund. That's why Bund was a little bit against the territorial autonomy, as it endangered its own existence. In conclusion, next slide, please. The Bolsheviks were one of the first to notice the importance of nation, and they consolidated this idea in their documents. Up to this date, their legacy in the sphere continues, because nowadays the UN uses Lenin's definition of this right. We know that a lot of their ideas came from their debates with Australian colleagues. That is why we compared their views on the question and found some similarities as well as a lot of distinctions. First of all, Austro-Hungarian communists viewed the nation as a group of people with their unique culture. And this aspect, culture, was the main point. Bolsheviks thought that nation is more than just culture. Nations must also have the ability to decide their own policy, make decisions, and use natural resources. This is why Austro-Hungarians thought that cultural autonomy was a good choice, while Bolsheviks decided that territorial autonomy was better. Secondly, Bolsheviks claimed that nation will disappear in the world of socialism, while their colleagues thought that nations would continue to exist in another way. Finally, they all claimed that the right of nations to self-determination is utilitarian. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, guys. It was really, really interesting. And the way you presented the results in such a comprehensible way, it really helped with understanding of your theme. So now we also have time for one question. And if anyone has them, if not, then we will also have time for questions in the end. But right now, I would love to move on to the final presentation of today. And this presentation will be held by Daria Chaganova, who is not only a member, but also the manager of our research group and the only postgraduate student in our group. So take it away, Daria.
Thanks, Yeva, and please be free to interrupt me if I am out of my time. Be free. Good evening, all. And now we will develop the topic of just war in our research group. I will research just war concept in the USSR in the period of 1970 till 1945. And I focused on the question whether the Soviet theory of war articulates a ship's collision at sea, and if so, whether Soviet theorists put forward any criteria according to which it can be considered just to combat. Next slide, please. My research question of this year is written on the slide, but why study naval law in the context of justice? I suppose there are several reasons why we should pay attention to whether the naval battles and justice are conceptualized in the USSR in the early period. First, if there is separate rhetoric for justice for sea and land battles in the theory of any state, it means that there are different goals and means to achieve them in these spaces for a country. Secondly, since the word ocean connects all the countries, the formation of rules and laws and their affinity to world standards demonstrate how a country relates to the other ones, to the other powers in the world. Thirdly, a special area of our interest, of my interest this year, was the law of the sea. Unlike other countries, the Soviet republics in the 20th century faced with the need to create a new set of laws. In the Russian Empire, there was no developed code of maritime law, and the system of rules and navigation was drawn up at the beginning of 18th century under Emperor Peter the Great. Thus, we can see how the young Soviet state builds up a system of rules and what principles the latter is based on. Next slide, please. Okay, in this slide, you can see what the purposes of my research were. Reading the Soviet theories of law of the sea from 1917 to 1945, I noted that there are three main trends. Before highlighting them, I will note that I do not associate any trend with a certain time period strictly, since the different examples are demonstrated in all the periods. But first trend is the aspiration to correspond with the international standard of law, speaking with the world powers in the same language. Another strong trend is the understanding of the sea as an economic field that facilitates the delivery of goods under a certain contract. This tendency was especially vivid from 1928 to the mid-30s. And finally, the consideration of the sea as a field of conflict, where certain rules apply, is also encountered, but is there a mention of justice here? Let's start by looking at the first two trends. Next slide. In the early 20s, the USSR was faced with an economic blockade, and therefore the Soviet Union used all the opportunities to participate in resolving international issues regarding the sea. But there is no consideration of conducting maritime conflicts. I believe this is primarily due to the fact that the First World War ended recently, but also the Soviet Union was a very young state. It faced with a task of at least creating a system and to create a working one. But we can note that in matters that have a potential for conflict, the USSR adheres to legal custom, like in the case with Wrangel Island. We can see the icebreaker Krasny Oktyabr, the Red October, in the right side of the slide. In the 30s, the USSR theorists spoke especially vividly about function of the sea as bringing together the countries in the world. I think I need the next slide. No, I'm sorry, Yeva, we should turn the last one. Okay, I see. We can see the quote at the top of the slide, I just didn't see it. It's one of the theorists, Rikachev, who says, I quote, "The law of the sea has an inner tendency to unite, to harmonize the norms of one state with the norms of the other." So in the surges, we see the tendency that sea or the high seas have a tendency to unite in an economic sense. Yeah, but basic theoretical sources about naval power were translated, but not written into Russian. For example, in 1939, the books of prominent theorist Alfred Mann were translated. As for ethical issues, it's especially good to note that because of the ideology of the socialism, a strict system of ethical views on relations within the sailors was developed. The attention of theorists is devoted to the fact that equality of conditions of service is necessary regardless of the rank of the employee. It is demonstrated, for example, in film The Sailors. We can see the poster here. So next slide, please. I will go up with my conclusions. So what we can see about the justice in the sea conflicts, sea battles in the early Soviet era. The justice of collisions at sea is fully and rarely considered. Of course, we can sometimes know the characterization of naval battles as just or unjust, barbarous or conquering, but much more attention is devoted to solving more practical issues. The theory regarding naval power is mostly found in translated sources, as Mahan. As for the corpus of law of the sea in the early Soviet era, it represents a reflection on economic issues. Finally, when theorists talk about naval combat, it is more likely to be perceived as supporting one to the main battle. The main battle goes on the land. The strategy and propaganda were focused on the battle waged on land. Despite the fact that we came to a negative answer, the answer is no, the justice of naval battles is not actually actively considered in the Soviet Union in the early era. Despite this negative answer, it characterizes the goals of the USSR as a young state in a given time period. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Daria. Right on time. Amazing. Yeah, so obviously we have time for questions for Daria. And simultaneously, as we have concluded our last presentation of the evening, if you have any questions regarding anything you heard today, regarding the way the research group generally works, maybe something for your future research, we would love to answer if you have these questions. And if not, then you can still ask questions, but I would like to refer you to our contact. We have a page on the Higher School of Economics official website. You can see the link here on the screen. And also, if you have questions in regards to how we function, how you can maybe become a part of research, I will have to direct you to Arseniy Kumankov, who is the leader of our group. Arseniy Dmitrievich, if you would like to add
He is not with us,
anything. Okay, maybe technical issues again. So yeah, I already received a couple of letters from people that were not able to attend our seminar today, asking if the recording of the seminar will be available. It will be available. we will post all the information that you might be interested in on our website. And you can always direct your messages to the email from which I sent you the invitations. And I will redirect you to whomever it is concerning. Like if you have questions about the naval law, if you have questions about terrorism, or the concept of nations, or the discussion on Clausewitz, we will be happy to answer all of your questions. And right now, if there are no questions left,
I would add, sorry, Yeva, we also have a YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah.
But, it's in Russian still, we have it, and maybe there will be some English language content soon.
Well, yeah, this seminar will obviously be in English. So everyone that is interested, yes, come on our journey of discovery of the great military history of Soviet Union, because it obviously has a significant and irreplaceable impact on the military history worldwide. So, yeah.
I have a question actually. So I'm on your webpage right now, but it's all in Russian. Do you also have an English version of the website, or is it all in Russian?
Yes, great question. We will soon be updating the website. Yes, because all the texts there are in Russian right now, but sadly the recordings of our seminars, as they were conducted in Russian, we cannot really translate them, although we have annotations for every single one. And also, if again, you have any questions about specific topics, you can address them in an email, and I will answer all of your questions or direct you to one of the members of our group that can do that.
Perfect. Very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, if there are no more questions, then I think we can end it here. Again, thank you so much for each and every one of you for joining us. Thank you to my excellent colleagues that prepared this seminar and that worked so hard throughout this year. I really think that we did something here, something significant and important. So we will see you later. Hopefully you will text us, write us. And yeah, wait for the recording of the seminar that you can follow on the official page of our group. Thank you.
Thank you, Yeva, for being a perfect moderator.
Yeah, thank you, Yeva.
So of today's seminar.
Thank
Спасибо,
you.
Ева. Блестяще провели.
Thank you so much for giving your trust.